you. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Thank you for wearing purple in honor of Minnesota's Prince. Now, she told me it's the suffragette colors with the green and purple, but I'm not going with that. I'm going with the Minnesota. And also for mentioning my mentor, Walter Mondale, who really is and still is an incredible man in his late 80s, doing very well. And I do remember that internship I always tell young people this, that when I got to his office, I'm working for the Vice President of the United States. I'm a student, I'm so excited. I'm gonna write all these policy pieces, and they assigned me to do the furniture inventory for the entire office of the staff. I literally had to crawl under every sofa, lamp, and table and write down the serial numbers, and there I learned two things. As everyone at NDI, I found out that the Vice President was incredibly honest. Nothing was missing. And the second thing, as I tell young people, take those first jobs seriously. That was my first job in Washington. This was my second. So there you go. So it is truly great to be here with Secretary Albright. She's a source of inspiration for me. She is, to put it quite simply, a force of nature. And as we all know, forces of nature never retire. And I got to see her firsthand in our state with a bunch of, well, we'll say millennials, right? And I loved how these young people, who really were maybe some of them not even born yet, when she got her stuff and started in politics, and just the way she could relate to them and how much they admired her. And I try to take that lesson with my own daughter, who is now 20, and I'm lucky if she'll return my text. But it is, you really are something, and we thank you for that leadership. And I think there's actually 2 points of her resume worth talking about today, and get me to my main points. The first, of course, is that you are an immigrant, a refugee, born in Prague, fled Czechoslovakia with her family twice, first to escape the Nazis and later to escape communism. Like so many Americans born in other places, the United States was the Secretary's refuge. And I've thought about that a lot lately, in that our state is home to the largest population of Somalis. And I stood with them after 9/11. I was the prosecutor then when there were hate crimes and things were going on, but nothing compares to what's happening right now. I was at a mosque a few weeks ago and heard the story of a family where the family had just simply gone out to dinner. A woman and her husband, they were Muslim, and their 2 young children. And a man walks by and says, "All of you, go home. Go home to where you came from." And the little girl, who's never heard anything like this in her life, looks up at her mom and says, "Mom, you said we could go out to dinner tonight. I don't want to go home and eat dinner." Those are the innocent words of a child. She knows no other home. Minnesota is her home. The United States is her home. So I think the Secretary's story and the stories of many in this room that come from other countries have to be celebrated and then firmly reminded. People need to be firmly reminded of them today, because perhaps that little girl will grow up to be a doctor or a teacher or maybe even Secretary of State. Because of this courageous woman and so many others like her, we know that is possible in today's world. The second piece of Secretary Albright's story that stands out, that's kind of my topic today, is her being first as a woman, many, many times first as a woman. And I think that we look at the fact of how women govern and how they do, and now they're not all the same. I do come from the state of Michelle Bachmann, so I know there's different issues, that people can have different ideologies, although she and I did work together just fine. But there are different issues. But when I look at it just as a whole and look at some of the issues that we're dealing with around the world and how countries, as we all know, and I see Tina Chen here, Michelle Obama's chief of staff, thank you for being there, as well as the Congresswoman Matsu has joined us here. As they know, we tend to do better when women are in charge, or at least when women are on the same footing as men. As the secretary once said, "I did not want to just be a woman Secretary of State. I wanted to be a Secretary of State who was a woman, but not just chosen for that particular reason." Of course, she doesn't stand alone. And I was once asked, this was someone, I think it was Barbara Lee, who did research on women leaders, and she would use this, and I would always couch it that I didn't agree with the whole thing. But she once said that a women leader should speak softly, okay, I don't agree with that, and carry a big statistic, okay? That was a good NDI joke, a little history there, but so carry a big statistic. It's just my experience that a lot of women that rise in power, as Elizabeth knows, tend to do this being accountable. They're not going to be able to strut out in a flight suit on a flight deck and say mission accomplished even though it wasn't, and do things like that. They are much more likely to have numbers. I remember when I was running for office, I would always be looking at like Janet Napolitano was the Attorney General, and she would show what her promises were and what they made. I had no one else to look at when I was running for the county attorney, so I would look at the fact that these women set goals. And so we have all these anecdotes about women in the Senate in particular, but now we know it's true because Harvard did a study. And that, in fact, in 2015, they did this study, so it's recent. They said that the women of the Senate, the 20 of us, they can't call us Sweet 16 anymore, that we work harder, that we've introduced more bills, that we work together better, that we pass more bills together, that we support each other. They actually have the numbers. And I have seen this in action. Probably my lowest moment of the time I've been there, there have been many, but was the government, the night we were voting on the fiscal cliff. This predated the shutdown. And we were voting in midnight on New Year's Eve. Remember, this is like, that magic moment, New Year's Eve, midnight. Tom Daschle knows these late nights in the Senate, but New Year's Eve is really a low point. So there I am on the Senate floor. This is a true story. At midnight, clock strikes 12. I look to my left, I see Harry Reid. I look to my right, I see Mitch McConnell. Every girl's dream on New Year's Eve. And I thought, okay, doesn't get much worse than this. So what comes up? But we get through that night, and then what happens? Then we get into, shortly thereafter, this shutdown, which was the whole Ted Cruz thing and reading Dr. Seuss, and I won't get into it, but it was really bad. And we were losing billions of dollars, and everyone's kind of sitting around, and then who stands up and gives a speech but Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, one of Jane's good friends, stands up and gives a speech. And of course, all of the northern senators, by the way, are there because we can't go home because people would say, why aren't you getting this thing done? Why are you home? So we're all there. So who's the first one that calls her? Me. I called her as the first Democrat. We decided to form this group called the Common Sense Caucus. We have 14 of us in there, half women, no surprise. We let McCain in, but we had 14 of us. We had 14 of us in there, and we actually came up with an idea of how to resolve this. We brought it to both leaders after about 10 days and said, we have reserved the press gallery for noon, and if you don't do something like this, which was a very short time leash because we wanted to harness the fact that the public was so pissed off. And we figured if we can just get a short time leash and then we can go into getting rid of the sequestration, get a budget, we said we're going to go out there. And they came up with literally nearly an identical plan a few hours later, and we got out of that shutdown. Then Patty Murray took it on and negotiated with Paul Ryan. We got out from there, and then Barbara Mikulski, kind of a woman's story, then ended up negotiating a budget. So that's just some examples of women in leadership in the Senate, whether it's Dianne Feinstein leading that landmark report on torture, whether it's the work Lisa Murkowski and Maria Cantwell just did on the energy efficiency bill, Debbie Stabenow leading the farm bill, Barbara Boxer negotiating with the likes of Vitter and Inhofe to pass a transportation bill and a Water Resource Development Act. The women have been focused on results. And so that is what I take that principle and put it into our foreign policy quagmire that we're seeing kind of in the discussions right now in the Senate, which, we've, under the president's leadership, I think we've moved ahead on a number of really important issues. But I still think that it's not that it used to be just this protected bipartisan area when it came to foreign aid and things like that. And that just hasn't happened. So I would put forth this idea that the more we can focus, one, on the women in the Senate who tend to be good at getting things done together. We have our secret dinners. We just had one in Deb Fisher's place last night. We never talk about the men. all. But anyway, so I think we actually play a very good role there. And then just kind of the common sense that we need. When I talk about the work that I've done with foreign relations, I always like to talk about David Ignatius wrote a column a while back, and he called it the internationalism of the heartland. This idea of this common sense from the past of people like Howard Baker and Fulbright and Mike Mansfield and Walter Mondale, and that you can't just have policy that's made on the coast. And we've got a lot of strong women in the middle of the country right now with Debbie Stabenow and Claire McCaskill and Tammy Baldwin and others. And so I think taking that kind of sensibility and trying to focus on the women's issue through that lens is a smart way to go. The way I look at this one, security, updating our military first. Number two, it's not easy in this presidential year, but keeping the light going on talking about trade and talking about exports, the fact that 95% of the world's customers live outside of our borders. And then finally, how we talk about foreign aid and how we talk about humanitarianism and how we work to get that done. Women of the Senate, whether it was the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, whether it was, we worked back then with Laura Bush on that, and whether it was the recent efforts of Samantha Power to release a number of women prisoners that have been held all over the world, and all 20 women senators joined her on that campaign. 4 have already been released. Sex trafficking, the issue that I took on, this was not easy last year, with Senator Cornyn. And I remember at one point, because the bill was stalled out because of various abortion issues, I spent 3 hours on the Senate floor reading from Nick Kristoff's and Cheryl Woodon's book, Half the Sky. Of course, you can't have the world without half the sky involved, right? And it starts out with a great quote from Mark Twain: "What would men be without women? Scarce, sir, mighty scarce." That really added some levity to what was a really hard issue on the Senate floor. No, it really didn't add any levity at all, but I tried. And so we were able to actually work that very difficult issue out because a bunch of us wouldn't give up, because all 20 women senators, Democrats and Republicans, demanded a hearing with the Judiciary Committee because the bill had been stalled out because of people like Heidi Heitkamp and others that kept the light on this issue, and we got it done. So I've just seen that happen time and time again. And I think not only is the women's rights are human rights are women's rights, got to be a centerpiece of our foreign policy, but you can see it operating in our own country. My favorite trip I've taken, well, except the Cuba one, because I'm carrying that bill, and that was pretty fun with the president recently, but my favorite trip that I've taken in the last few years was with 5 women senators. It was the first all-women's trip to Africa. And we were focused, of course, on women farmers, on women's agriculture development. We have a bunch of companies that have been working with USAID, and just a lot of exciting news, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room about that. But in the middle of this trip, we went to visit this woman farmer who was out in the middle of nowhere. It was a 2-hour Jeep ride from the airport. And we got to her place. She was a widow. She had 2 children. She had this tiny little hut. She was growing this really, really small plot of land where she grew teff. And that was it. And she was smiling in that hut. And she had gotten 1 solar panel from the Gates Foundation recently because of the leadership she had shown in her little village. And she was so proud of that solar panel because it allowed her kids to do their homework at night because it was dark otherwise at night. And we found out she walked an hour and a half every day to get water. And so the inevitable question is, well, what is your biggest challenge as a woman farmer? And she has nothing on her walls except this little piece of white paper with Post-it notes on that shows the 10 huts that she's responsible for, and whether or not they have an outhouse, whether or not their kids have gotten baby care. They've got little symbols on them. And we said, what's your biggest challenge? And she pointed to that Gates Foundation little board, and she said, challenges? I have no challenges. I am a leader. And so there it is, in one woman in a hut. So from this woman to the woman in the hut, we carry on. And I want to thank Madeleine for her leadership, for this incredible work you're doing for NDI. And what did you say, in our bizarre political situation that we find ourselves in? Never give up hope, and I hope I have given you some today. Thank you.
Senator, thank you so much for that amazing speech and just being proof of the fact that women make a difference. Minnesota's lucky, and therefore we are lucky to have you in Washington to help us through everything. Thank you so much. Now enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back.